Have you ever felt like you're the only one who sees the truth behind the masks we all wear? That sensation of standing in a room full of people, all pretending that everything is fine, when you can clearly see the pain in their eyes, the tension in their shoulders, the forced nature of their smiles. It's a peculiar kind of loneliness, isn't it? This awareness, this heightened perception that seems to separate you from others, while simultaneously connecting you to their deepest truths. I understand this feeling. The weight of seeing beneath the surface, of noticing the subtle inconsistencies between what people say and what their bodies reveal, between the words they choose and the emotions that flicker across their faces too quickly for most to notice. There's something profoundly isolating about carrying this awareness. You might find yourself in conversations where everyone is following an unspoken script, adhering to social conventions that feel hollow and meaningless, while you stand there, acutely aware of the authentic human beings hidden beneath these performances. It's like living in a world of mirrors where reflections bounce endlessly off one another, but you're desperately searching for what lies behind the glass. This disconnect between what you perceive and what others acknowledge can create a deep ache within you, a yearning for genuine connection that feels increasingly rare in our carefully curated world. But what if I told you that this sensitivity, this ability to see beyond the facades, isn't a burden to bear, but a gift to cultivate? What if this awareness is actually the doorway to the most meaningful connections and the most fulfilling way of being in the world? Today, I want to explore with you the profound insights of Carl Rogers, a psychologist who not only validated this way of seeing, but developed an entire approach to human connection based on the power of authenticity, acceptance, and deep understanding. His person-centered approach offers us not just psychological theory, but a practical pathway toward healing the very disconnection you may be feeling right now. Let me take you on a journey through Rogers' transformative ideas and show you how they might illuminate your own experience of being human in a world that often seems to value appearance over substance. The story of Carl Rogers begins not in a psychology laboratory or academic institution, but in the rich soil of a farm in Oak Park, Illinois, where he was born in 1902. This beginning matters because it speaks to the grounded, natural approach to human experience that would later define his work. Rogers grew up in a strict religious household, where specific rules and moral codes dictated behavior. The young Carl was sensitive, introspective, and somewhat isolated, characteristics that allowed him to observe the world around him with unusual clarity. Perhaps it was this early experience of living within rigid structures while harboring a rich inner life that sensitized him to the gap between outward conformity and inner authenticity. As a young man, Rogers initially pursued religious studies, intending to become a minister. But his intellectual curiosity led him toward psychology, where he found himself dissatisfied with the dominant approaches of his time. Freudian psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on unconscious drives, and behaviorism, with its focus on external conditioning. Neither seemed to capture the lived experience of being human that Rogers found so compelling. What emerged from his dissatisfaction was revolutionary, a therapeutic approach centered not on the therapist as expert, but on the client as the authority of their own experience. Rogers came to believe that each person has within themselves the capacity for self-understanding and growth. This belief wasn't merely theoretical. It came from Rogers' direct experience of sitting with clients and truly listening to them, not through the lens of preconceived psychological theories, but with an openness to their unique reality. This was radical in the 1940s and 50s, when psychological practice was dominated by diagnostic categories and expert interpretations. Rogers dared to suggest that the person sitting across from him knew more about their experience than he did, and that his role was not to analyze or direct, but to create conditions in which natural healing and growth could occur. Rogers identified 3 core conditions necessary for this therapeutic relationship: congruence, authenticity, unconditional positive regard, complete acceptance, and empathic understanding. Let's explore each of these, not as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences that might resonate with your own journey. Congruence or authenticity means being genuinely yourself, without hiding behind professional facades or expert personas. For Rogers, this meant acknowledging his own feelings and reactions in the therapeutic relationship, rather than maintaining a blank, neutral presence. Imagine the relief of being with someone who isn't performing, who isn't hiding behind social masks or professional distance, but is simply present as a real human being, There's something profoundly healing about this kind of authenticity. It creates a space where you too can set down your defenses and simply be. Have you experienced moments like this in your life? Perhaps with a close friend, a loved one, or even briefly with a stranger? Those rare interactions where pretense falls away and something genuine emerges? These moments often stand out in our memory precisely because they contrast so sharply with our everyday experiences of carefully managed impressions and strategic self-presentation. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you about your own experience with authenticity. When was the last time you felt completely yourself with another person? What was that experience like for you? How did it feel in your body, in your emotions? I know these can be difficult questions to answer, as we often don't have the language to describe these deep internal states. But there's something powerful about naming our experiences, about bringing them into conscious awareness. If you're comfortable, I invite you to share in the comments below using the prompt, "I feel most authentic when..." Your words might be simple or complex, it doesn't matter. What matters is the honest reflection. And know that your sharing creates ripples. Someone watching might recognize themselves in your words and feel less alone in their experience. And now, continuing our exploration of Roger's core conditions, let's turn to the second, unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is perhaps one of the most misunderstood yet transformative elements of Roger's approach. It doesn't mean approving of everything a person does or thinks. Rather, it means separating the person's inherent worth from their behaviors or beliefs. It means holding them in a state of complete acceptance as a valuable human being, regardless of what they reveal about themselves. Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to be in the presence of someone who accepts you entirely, your flaws, your mistakes, your shameful thoughts, your failures, without judgment. Not because they're overlooking these aspects of you, but because they see that these elements don't diminish your fundamental worth as a human being. This isn't the conditional acceptance we're usually offered in life. I'll accept you if you succeed. I'll love you if you behave. I'll stay with you if you meet my needs. This is a radical form of acceptance that doesn't depend on what you do or don't do. It's acceptance of your very being. Rogers believed that this kind of acceptance creates the psychological safety necessary for genuine exploration and change. When we don't have to defend ourselves against judgment, we can look honestly at our experiences, thoughts, and behaviors. We can acknowledge aspects of ourselves that we normally keep hidden, even from our own awareness. And paradoxically, it's only when we fully accept ourselves as we are that meaningful change becomes possible. The third condition, empathic understanding, goes beyond sympathy or intellectual comprehension. It involves entering the private perceptual world of the other person and becoming thoroughly at home in it. It means temporarily living in their life, moving about in it delicately without making judgments. This isn't about analyzing or evaluating. It's about sensing meanings that are hardly known even to the person experiencing them. Rogers described this as sensing the client's anger, fear, or confusion as if it were your own, yet without your own anger, fear, or confusion getting bound up in it. This kind of deep understanding is rare in our everyday interactions, where we're often formulating our responses while the other person is still speaking, or interpreting their words through the filter of our own experiences and biases. True empathic understanding requires a profound kind of presence, a setting aside of our own perspective to fully enter another's. When someone experiences being deeply understood in this way, the effect can be transformative. There's a sense of being seen and valued that validates their experience in a fundamental way. Many of Roger's clients described this experience as revelatory. Sometimes it was the first time they had felt truly understood by another person. Together, these three conditions, congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding, create what Rogers called a growth-promoting climate. In this psychological climate, people naturally move toward greater self-understanding, self-acceptance, and an openness to experience that allows for positive change. Rogers called this innate movement the actualizing tendency, the basic drive toward fulfillment, maturation, and enrichment of life that exists in every living organism. Just as a plant will naturally grow toward the light when given proper conditions of soil, water, and sun, Rogers believed that humans naturally develop in positive, constructive directions when provided with the right relational environment. This view stands in stark contrast to perspectives that see human nature as fundamentally flawed or destructive. Rogers wasn't naive about the capacity for human cruelty or self-destruction, But he understood these as distortions that occur when our basic need for positive regard is thwarted or made conditional early in life. When children learn that they are valued only when they behave in certain ways, they begin to internalize these conditions of worth. They learn to disown parts of their experience that seem unacceptable to important others, creating a gap between their authentic experiencing and their self-concept. This gap, between who we really are and who we think we should be to be worthy of love, is at the root of much psychological distress. Rogers' approach to healing this divide was revolutionary in its simplicity. Provide a relationship characterized by the three core conditions and trust the individual's inherent tendency toward growth and integration. This doesn't mean that the process is easy or painless. Often the journey toward greater authenticity involves confronting painful truths that have long been avoided. It might mean acknowledging feelings we've been taught are unacceptable: anger, jealousy, neediness, or desire. It might mean recognizing ways we've betrayed ourselves to maintain relationships or social standing. It might mean grieving opportunities lost to fear or conformity. But Rogers observed that when people feel safe enough to explore these difficult truths, they naturally move toward greater wholeness. The parts of themselves they've disowned begin to be reclaimed and integrated. Their self-concept becomes more congruent with their actual experiencing. And as this happens, they typically become more accepting of others as well. There's a beautiful ripple effect that occurs. As we learn to embrace our own humanity and all its complexity, we develop a greater capacity to embrace the humanity of those around us. We become less threatened by difference, less rigid in our judgments, more open to the rich variety of human experience. This brings us to a profound question. What would our world look like if more of our relationships, personal, professional, political, were characterized by these core conditions? What if our educational systems prioritized creating growth-promoting climates rather than standardized outcomes? What if our workplaces valued authentic self-expression over conformity to corporate cultures? What if our political discourse was grounded in empathic understanding rather than adversarial debate? Rogers himself became increasingly interested in these broader applications of his work as his career progressed. He facilitated large group experiences and international peace workshops, bringing together individuals from conflicting groups to engage in authentic dialogue. He witnessed how the same principles that fostered individual growth could transform conflicts between groups with long histories of hostility and misunderstanding. The key was creating a context in which people could be heard not as representatives of opposing positions, but as human beings with real fears, needs, and hopes. When this kind of hearing occurs, something shifts. The rigid boundaries between us and them begin to soften. New possibilities emerge that couldn't be seen from within the polarized perspectives. The revolutionary potential of Rogers' approach lies in its challenge to traditional power structures. When we truly embrace the idea that each person is the authority of their own experience, that they possess within themselves the capacity for self-understanding and positive change, we fundamentally alter the dynamic of helper and helped, teacher and student, leader and follower. We move from hierarchical to collaborative relationships, from expertise to partnership, from control to trust. This isn't to say that differences in knowledge or skill disappear, but rather that these differences don't translate into a right to direct others' lives or define their reality. In a truly person-centered approach, power is shared. The expert brings their knowledge and skill, but the individual brings the expertise of their own lived experience, and both are valued. This redistribution of power can be threatening to established systems and to those accustomed to holding authority. It requires a willingness to relinquish control, to trust in processes that can't be predetermined or managed. It calls for a tolerance of uncertainty and a faith in the unfolding of human potential that runs counter to our typical desire for predictability and control. Perhaps this is why, despite the demonstrated effectiveness of Rogers' approach, it has often been marginalized in favor of more directive therapies or reduced to a set of techniques rather than embraced as a fundamentally different way of being in relationship. Yet the hunger for authentic connection remains. In our increasingly digitized world, where so much of our interaction is mediated through screens and carefully curated presentations of self, the yearning for real human contact only grows stronger. We sense the inadequacy of our virtual connections, the thinness of relationships based on performance rather than presence. We long for the experience of being truly seen, heard, and accepted, not for what we project or achieve, but for who we are beneath all of that. This longing points us back to Rogers' essential insight. that healing and growth occur within the context of certain kinds of relationships. Not because these relationships provide expert guidance or clever interventions, but because they create a space in which we can reconnect with our own authentic experiencing, reclaim disowned parts of ourselves, and integrate these into a more whole and accurate sense of who we are. The beauty of this approach is its universal application. While not everyone can be a trained therapist, the core conditions Rogers identified can be cultivated in any relationship. We can all practice greater congruence, letting go of facades, and allowing ourselves to be more transparently present with others. We can all develop our capacity for unconditional acceptance, separating a person's inherent worth from their behaviors or beliefs. We can all deepen our empathic understanding, setting aside our own perspective temporarily to enter more fully into another's experiential world. The practice of these conditions is both simple and challenging. Simple in that it doesn't require specialized knowledge or techniques, just a willingness to be present as a real human being with another real human being. Challenging in that it runs counter to many of our ingrained habits of interaction. Our education and socialization often train us to present carefully managed impressions, to judge others' worth based on their achievements or behaviors, and to listen through the filter of our own perspectives rather than truly entering another's world. Changing these patterns requires intentional practice and a willingness to risk greater vulnerability. It means letting go of the illusion of control that comes with maintaining a consistent facade. It means opening ourselves to aspects of others' experience that might challenge our assumptions or make us uncomfortable. It means developing the capacity to be present with someone else's pain without immediately trying to fix or alleviate it. These aren't easy shifts, but they're profoundly rewarding. As we learn to be more authentically present with others, we also become more authentically present with ourselves. As we practice unconditional acceptance of others, we begin to extend the same acceptance to parts of ourselves we've previously rejected. As we deepen our empathic understanding of others' experiences, we develop greater clarity and compassion toward our own internal processes. Rogers' vision wasn't limited to individual healing. He saw the principles of person-centered therapy as a pathway to broader social transformation. He believed that as individuals became more fully themselves, more congruent, more accepting, more empathically connected, they would naturally create relationships, organizations, and systems that reflected these qualities. The person-centered approach, then, isn't just a method of psychotherapy. It's a way of being in the world that has revolutionary implications for how we structure our collective life. Imagine educational systems designed around the principle of unconditional positive regard, where students' inherent worth isn't tied to their performance or compliance. Imagine healthcare systems that honor patients as the primary authorities of their own experience, where medical expertise serves rather than dictates personal health decisions. Imagine political structures that prioritize empathic understanding across differences, creating spaces for authentic dialogue rather than adversarial debate. These aren't utopian fantasies, but practical extensions of principles that have proven effective at the individual level. They represent a shift from control to trust, from standardization to personalization, from hierarchy to collaboration. This shift doesn't mean abandoning expertise or structure, but rather placing these in service to the fundamental human capacity for self-direction and growth. Of course, such transformation doesn't happen overnight or without resistance. Established systems have tremendous inertia, and those who benefit from current power arrangements may be reluctant to embrace approaches that redistribute authority. But change begins with individuals who are willing to practice new ways of being and relating. It spreads through relationships where these practices create tangible benefits for all involved. It grows as these relationships form networks that demonstrate alternative possibilities for organizing our collective life. Rogers himself witnessed this kind of organic change in his work with large groups and international conflicts. He saw how creating a context of safety and respect allowed for authentic expression that cut through entrenched positions and opened new possibilities for understanding and collaboration. He observed how hierarchical structures naturally flattened when participants were invited into genuine dialogue, rather than positioned as opponents or competitors. He noted how creativity and problem-solving flourished when people felt free to express their authentic thoughts and feelings without fear of rejection or reprisal. These observations suggest that the person-centered approach isn't just a nice idea, but a practical methodology for addressing complex social challenges. I want to pause here for a moment and acknowledge the challenge inherent in what I'm proposing. In a world that often rewards conformity, that privileges intellect over emotion, that values certainty over openness to experience, choosing to be more authentic can feel risky. Being willing to see beneath the surface when others prefer to maintain comfortable illusions can be isolating. Developing the capacity for unconditional acceptance in a culture that constantly evaluates and ranks requires swimming against a powerful current. I don't suggest that this path is easy, but I do believe, based on Roger's work and my own experience, that it leads to a quality of life and relationship that makes the difficulty worthwhile. There's a freedom that comes with greater congruence, a release from the exhaustion of maintaining facades and managing impressions. There's a profound connection possible through empathic understanding, a bridge across the existential loneliness that so many experience. There's a spaciousness created by unconditional acceptance, room to explore, to make mistakes, to grow without the constricting fear of judgment. These qualities transform not just individual lives, but the fabric of our communities and societies. If this message touches something within you, if you recognize in Roger's approach a path that resonates with your own deepest values or longings, I invite you to join me on this journey of exploration. This channel is dedicated to applying these profound insights to the challenges and opportunities of everyday life. Unlike so much of the self-help content that promises quick fixes or simplistic solutions, we're committed to honoring the complexity of human experience while offering practical pathways toward greater authenticity, acceptance, and understanding. We draw on Roger's person-centered approach not as a rigid doctrine, but as a living, evolving framework for being more fully human with ourselves and each other. If this perspective speaks to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It's not just about growing our numbers, but about building a community of individuals committed to this way of being in the world. Each notification becomes an invitation to pause, to reconnect with these principles, to remember the possibility of different kinds of relationships and different ways of structuring our shared life. Your presence and participation matter, not just to the success of this channel, but to the broader movement toward more humane and growth-promoting ways of living together. Let's continue this exploration together, discovering what becomes possible when we create spaces characterized by authenticity, acceptance, and deep understanding. The world needs these qualities now more than ever, and each of us has the capacity to embody them in our own unique way. Let's return to where we began, that feeling of seeing beneath the surface, of noticing what others pretend not to see. In light of Roger's approach, we might understand this sensitivity not as a burden that separates you from others, but as a gift that allows for deeper, more authentic connection. Your capacity to perceive beyond facades, to sense the incongruence between outward presentation and inner experience, gives you a special role to play in creating spaces where greater authenticity becomes possible. When you respond to what's real rather than what's presented, you offer others an invitation to step beyond their own performances. When you remain present with the complexity of human experience, rather than reducing it to simplified categories or judgments, you create room for others to embrace their own complexity. When you listen for the meaning beneath the words, tracking the felt sense of what someone is trying to communicate, rather than just their verbal content, you model a kind of attention that honors the fullness of human experiencing. These seemingly small acts ripple outward, creating moments of possibility in which different kinds of interactions can emerge. They don't guarantee transformation. Others may not be ready or willing to meet you in this more authentic space, but they create openings, chances for something beyond the usual scripts and roles. Roger's research and clinical experience suggest that when even one person in a relationship shifts toward greater authenticity, acceptance, and empathic understanding, it often catalyzes change in the entire relational system. Not because the person is trying to change others, but because they're creating conditions in which others naturally move toward their own growth and integration. This isn't about manipulation or having a hidden agenda for how others should be. It's about showing up differently yourself and trusting in the natural movement toward actualization that occurs when conditions are favorable. This trust in natural processes is perhaps the most radical aspect of Roger's approach. In a culture obsessed with control and predictability, with measuring and managing outcomes, there's something revolutionary about creating conditions and then stepping back to allow natural development to unfold. It requires a deep humility, an acknowledgement that we don't know exactly what form another person's growth should take. It calls for patience, a willingness to let processes unfold at their own pace rather than pushing for quick results. It demands presence, a capacity to be with what is emerging rather than constantly intervening to shape it according to our expectations. These qualities run counter to our typical ways of relating, which often involve subtle or overt attempts to control others' behavior or direct their development according to our own values or needs. The alternative Rogers offers is not passivity, but a different kind of influence, one based on creating favorable conditions rather than applying pressure or direction. Think of a gardener who doesn't force plants to grow, but provides soil, water, sunlight, and protection from extreme conditions, trusting the innate wisdom of the plant to develop according to its own nature. Or consider how a skilled midwife supports the birthing process, not by controlling it, but by creating conditions in which natural processes can unfold as smoothly as possible, intervening only when necessary to remove obstacles or address complications. These metaphors capture something essential about the person-centered approach: its respect for the inherent wisdom of natural processes, and its focus on creating contexts in which these processes can unfold optimally. This respect extends to all aspects of human experiencing, not just the rational or positive parts, but the full spectrum of emotion, sensation, intuition, and thought that constitutes our moment-to-moment reality. Rogers believed that when people are free to experience this full range without defense or distortion, they naturally move toward greater integration and more effective functioning. Not because someone is directing this movement, but because the actualizing tendency, that basic drive toward fulfillment and enhancement that exists in all living organisms, is operating without interference. This brings us to another core aspect of Rogers' approach: its emphasis on process over content. Unlike therapies that focus on specific techniques for addressing particular problems, the person-centered approach attends primarily to the quality of the therapeutic relationship and the process of the client's experiencing. Rogers observed that when the three core conditions were present to a high degree, clients naturally moved through a predictable process of change, regardless of their presenting issues or diagnoses. This process typically begins with a loosening of rigid constructs about self and experience, proceeds through a phase of exploration and differentiation of feelings and perceptions, and culminates in greater integration and openness to experience. The therapist doesn't direct this process or establish its goals, but rather stays present to it as it unfolds, offering the continuing conditions that make its natural movement possible. This focus on process has important implications for how we think about helping relationships of all kinds. It suggests that the most powerful thing we can offer another person is not our expertise or advice, not our analysis or interpretation, but our presence, our willingness to be with them in a certain way as they explore their own experience and find their own direction. It implies that we don't need to know in advance where someone should end up or what's best for them, only how to create conditions in which they can connect more fully with their own experiencing and find their own answers. This doesn't mean that specific knowledge or skills are irrelevant. Rogers himself was highly educated and brought considerable expertise to his work, but he held this expertise lightly, using it to inform his understanding rather than to direct his client's process. He remained open to being surprised, to having his assumptions challenged, to learning from each unique individual he encountered. This combination of knowledge and openness, of expertise and humility, offers a model for helping relationships that honors both the helper's training and the helped person's autonomy. It suggests a middle path between the extremes of directive expertise that minimizes client agency and a hands-off approach that withholds potentially valuable resources. The person-centered way involves bringing all of one's knowledge and skill to the relationship while simultaneously respecting the other's capacity for self-direction and growth. This balance isn't achieved through a formula or technique, but through an ongoing attunement to the relationship itself, a willingness to adjust one's level of active intervention based on the needs and preferences of the specific individual in the specific moment. It requires a kind of presence that goes beyond the application of methods to a genuine meeting between two human beings, each bringing their whole self to the encounter. If this resonates with your experience of being with others, if you find yourself naturally inclined toward this kind of presence rather than toward direction or control, you might be what Rogers would call a natural therapist, someone who intuitively creates conditions in which others feel safe to explore and grow. Many people with this natural orientation don't recognize it as a special capacity because it feels so normal to them. They may even discount it as just listening or being a good friend, not realizing the profound impact this way of being can have on those around them. If you're one of these people, I want to affirm the value of what you offer. In a world where genuine presence and authentic connection are increasingly rare, your capacity to create spaces of safety and acceptance is a precious gift. Whether you express this in professional helping roles or simply in your everyday relationships, you're contributing to the healing of the disconnection that characterizes so much of our modern experience. You're creating ripples of possibility that extend far beyond the immediate interactions, influencing not just individuals, but the broader culture of relationships in which we're all embedded. This isn't to suggest that natural aptitude eliminates the need for training or development. Rogers himself was committed to ongoing learning and refinement of his approach, but it does validate the importance of personal qualities and ways of being that can't be reduced to techniques or methods. It acknowledges that some of the most powerful elements of healing relationships emerge not from what we do, but from who we are and how we're present with others. For those who don't identify as natural therapists, the good news is that the core conditions Rogers identified can be developed through practice and reflection. Congruence grows as we become more aware of our inner experiencing and more willing to express it appropriately. Unconditional positive regard expands as we examine and challenge our judgments, separating behavior from inherent worth. Empathic understanding deepens as we practice setting aside our own perspective to enter more fully into another's world. These aren't fixed traits, but capacities that can be cultivated over time. The first step is often simply becoming more aware of our current patterns of relating. How congruent are you in your various relationships? Are there some contexts where you feel free to be yourself and others where you maintain careful facades? What makes the difference? How conditional is your acceptance of others? Are there certain behaviors or characteristics that lead you to withdraw respect or positive regard? What beliefs or values underlie these conditions? How deeply do you listen when others speak? Are you truly attempting to understand their perspective, or are you filtering their words through your own framework, preparing your response while they're still expressing themselves? These kinds of reflective questions don't need to lead to harsh self-judgment. Rather, they offer starting points for gradual, compassionate development of more growth-promoting ways of being with others. As we develop these capacities, we contribute to a broader cultural shift toward more authentic and empathic forms of relationship. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to practice and embody a different way of being with others, one characterized by presence rather than performance, by acceptance rather than evaluation, by understanding rather than interpretation. Over time, these interactions create patterns that can transform the quality of our relationships and communities. They establish new norms and expectations that make it safer for everyone to be more fully themselves. They demonstrate alternatives to the competitive, judgmental, or manipulative dynamics that characterize so many of our social contexts. This isn't about imposing change on others, but about embodying a way of being that naturally invites and supports growth. It's about creating microclimates of authenticity, acceptance, and understanding within whatever environments we inhabit, trusting that these qualities will spread not through force, but through their intrinsic appeal to our deepest human needs. The beauty of this approach is that it starts exactly where you are, with the relationships and contexts that constitute your everyday life. You don't need special circumstances or optimal conditions to begin practicing greater congruence, acceptance, and empathic understanding. You simply need the willingness to show up differently in your existing relationships, to risk being a little more authentic, a little less judgmental, a little more present to others' experiencing. Each small shift creates ripples that influence the entire system of relationships in which you're embedded. If this message resonates with something in you, if it speaks to a longing for more authentic and meaningful connection, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here we'll continue to explore the profound insights of Carl Rogers and other humanistic thinkers, translating their wisdom into practical approaches to the challenges and opportunities of everyday life. Unlike much of the content you'll find on personal growth and relationships, we won't offer simplistic formulas or quick fixes. We'll honor the complexity and uniqueness of human experiencing while providing clear pathways toward greater authenticity, acceptance, and understanding. We'll draw on both scholarly research and lived experience, bringing together the best of rigorous thinking and practical application. If you're tired of surface-level advice that doesn't acknowledge the depth of human struggle or the complexity of genuine growth, this channel offers an alternative. a place where your whole experience is welcomed and where transformation is understood as an ongoing process rather than a destination to be reached. By turning on notifications, you'll ensure that you don't miss our regular explorations of these themes. Each notification becomes an invitation to reconnect with these principles, to remember the possibility of different kinds of relationships in the midst of everyday pressures and distractions. Your presence and participation matter, not just to the growth of this channel, but to the broader movement toward more humane and growth-promoting ways of living together. Let's continue this exploration together, discovering what becomes possible when we create spaces characterized by authenticity, acceptance, and deep understanding. As we come to the close of our time together today, I want to return to that initial experience we explored, the sensitivity that allows you to see beneath the surface, to notice what others pretend not to see. In light of Roger's approach, perhaps we can understand this capacity not as something that isolates you, but as a gift that enables you to create bridges across the existential loneliness that so many experience. Your ability to perceive beyond facades doesn't have to separate you from others. It can become the foundation for more authentic connections. When you respond to what's real rather than what's presented, when you remain present with the full complexity of human experience, when you listen for the meaning beneath the words, you create openings for different kinds of relationships to emerge. Not everyone will be ready to meet you in this more authentic space. Some may prefer the safety of familiar scripts and roles, the comfort of mutual pretense, and that's okay. Growth can't be forced or rushed. But for those who are ready, your willingness to be present in this way can create a context in which natural healing and growth occur. Not because you're directing or managing this process, but because you're providing the conditions in which the inherent tendency toward actualization can operate more freely. In this way, what might have felt like a burden, this heightened awareness of incongruence and disconnect, becomes a unique contribution you can make to the healing of our collective experiencing. Roger's vision wasn't limited to individual therapy or even to one-on-one relationships. He saw the principles of the person-centered approach as applicable to all levels of human system, from intimate partnerships to global conflicts. He believed that creating contexts characterized by authenticity, acceptance, and empathic understanding could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and societies. This broader vision becomes increasingly relevant in our current cultural moment, where polarization and disconnection threaten the very fabric of our shared life. The person-centered approach offers a pathway toward healing these divisions, not by minimizing differences or enforcing agreement, but by creating spaces where genuine dialogue across difference becomes possible. When people feel heard and accepted as they are, they become less defensive, more open to considering perspectives that challenge their own. When they experience empathic understanding, they develop greater capacity to extend the same understanding to others, even those with whom they deeply disagree. When they encounter others who are willing to be authentically present, rather than hiding behind ideological positions or group identities, they find it easier to access their own authenticity. These shifts don't erase differences or resolve all conflicts, but they create the possibility of more constructive engagement across our inevitable diversity of viewpoints and experiences. In closing, I want to acknowledge the courage it takes to choose this path of greater authenticity, acceptance, and understanding. In a culture that often rewards conformity, that privileges intellect over emotion, that values certainty over openness to experience, moving in this direction can feel risky. Being willing to see beneath the surface when others prefer comfortable illusions can be isolating. Developing the capacity for unconditional acceptance in a world that constantly evaluates and ranks requires swimming against powerful currents. I don't suggest that this path is easy, but I do believe, based on Roger's work and my own experience, that it leads to a quality of life and relationship that makes the difficulty worthwhile. There's a freedom that comes with greater congruence, a release from the exhaustion of maintaining facades and managing impressions. There's a profound connection possible through empathic understanding, a bridge across the existential loneliness that so many experience. There's a spaciousness created by unconditional acceptance, room to explore, to make mistakes, to grow without the constricting fear of judgment. These qualities transform not just individual lives, but the fabric of our communities and societies. As Rogers himself wrote near the end of his life, "When I look at the world, I'm pessimistic, but when I look at people, I am optimistic." This paradoxical perspective captures something essential about the person-centered approach. its clear-eyed recognition of our current challenges alongside its unshakable faith in our capacity for positive growth and connection. It's this combination of realism and hope that makes Roger's vision so compelling and so necessary in our present moment. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. I look forward to continuing the journey with you.